There's a widely held assumption about who actually survives a relationship with a narcissist. The toughest person in the room, the one with the sharpest boundaries from the very beginning, someone who was never particularly vulnerable to manipulation in the first place because she simply wasn't built that way. I want to tell you directly at the very start of this video that this assumption is wrong, and understanding exactly why it's wrong is going to change how you think about your own experience, especially if you've ever wondered why you, of all people, ended up in this relationship in the first place, or worried that surviving it required some kind of exceptional inner strength you're not sure you actually have. The type of person who actually survives a narcissist relationship, meaning survives it completely, emerges genuinely healed rather than simply hardened, and goes on to build something real afterward rather than repeating the same pattern with someone new, isn't the person who was never vulnerable. It's the person who was fully, completely vulnerable and who did something specific with that vulnerability once she finally recognized it clearly. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what separates genuine survival from the two more common outcomes that most people experience instead, and why the actual determining factor has almost nothing to do with the natural toughness most people assume is required. Let's start by understanding the three broad outcomes that tend to follow a significant relationship with a narcissist, because most discussions of this topic collapse into a false binary: either you get over it or you don't, when the reality is considerably more specific and more useful to understand in detail. The first outcome, and it's worth being honest that this is genuinely the most common one, is what we might call adaptive repetition. Someone who leaves the specific relationship, sometimes with real clarity about what happened, but who goes on, often within a relatively short period, to enter a strikingly similar relationship with someone else exhibiting nearly identical patterns. This isn't a failure of intelligence or insight. Many people in this category can describe in detailed, accurate psychological language exactly what happened to them and exactly what red flags they should have noticed. What's missing isn't understanding. It's something else, which we'll get to shortly. The second outcome is what we might call protective foreclosure, someone who successfully avoids repeating the pattern, but does so by closing off significant parts of herself in the process. This person often does genuinely leave the relationship and genuinely avoid entering another one structured the same way, which looks from the outside like clear success. But look closer, and a different picture often emerges. A persistent difficulty trusting anyone deeply again, a tendency to interpret ordinary vulnerability in new partners as suspicious, a kind of armor that protects effectively against being manipulated again while also, unfortunately, protecting against the genuine intimacy and openness that a healthy relationship actually requires. This person has survived in the sense of avoiding repetition, but she hasn't actually healed in the fuller sense the word implies. And this distinction matters enormously for understanding why this outcome, common as it is, isn't actually the one we're describing as genuine survival today. The third outcome, the rarest of the three, is what actually constitutes genuine survival. Someone who leaves the relationship, avoids repeating the pattern, and simultaneously retains or eventually rebuilds the full capacity for genuine trust, vulnerability, and openness in future relationships without either dynamic being compromised by what happened before. This person can love again fully without either recreating the old pattern or protecting herself so thoroughly that genuine intimacy becomes impossible. This is the actual outcome most people imagine when they picture surviving a narcissist, and it's worth understanding in detail exactly what separates the people who achieve it from the much larger number who end up in one of the two more common outcomes instead. Here's the answer, and it's worth stating directly before we unpack it further. The people who achieve genuine survival aren't the ones who were never vulnerable to begin with. They're the ones who developed a very specific capacity, almost always through the painful process of the relationship itself, that the other two outcomes never fully develop. The capacity to hold two things simultaneously that most people experience as contradictory: full accountability for their own patterns and choices, alongside complete self-compassion for having made those choices in the first place. This combination sounds simple, stated this plainly, but it's genuinely rare. And understanding why it's so rare explains everything about why most people end up in one of the two more common outcomes instead of this third, genuinely healing one. Let's understand why this specific combination is so difficult to achieve, because most people, in the aftermath of a relationship like this, tend to gravitate strongly toward one side of this pairing, while neglecting the other almost entirely, and each imbalance produces one of the two more common outcomes we described. Someone who leans heavily toward accountability without corresponding self-compassion tends to develop something that looks like insight but actually functions as harsh self-criticism, an accurate, detailed understanding of every red flag she missed, every boundary she failed to hold, every moment she now recognizes she should have left sooner. All of it processed through a lens of self-blame rather than genuine understanding. This person often becomes remarkably good at identifying manipulation patterns intellectually, which sounds like it should protect her from repetition. But without the corresponding self-compassion, this insight frequently gets weaponized against herself, rather than actually integrated into lasting change, producing a strange, paradoxical outcome. She understands the pattern perfectly and still finds herself repeating it, because the self-blame underneath her insight actually keeps her vulnerable to exactly the kind of low self-worth a narcissist's tactics depend on to function. Meanwhile, someone who leans heavily toward self-compassion without corresponding accountability tends to develop something different but equally limiting, a narrative where everything that happened gets fully, sometimes exclusively, attributed to the narcissist's manipulation, with very little examination of her own patterns, her own history, or her own vulnerabilities that made this specific dynamic possible in the first place. This might sound protective, and in an important sense, parts of it genuinely are. Narcissistic manipulation is real, and the harm caused by it is genuinely not the victim's fault in any moral sense. But without corresponding accountability for her own patterns, not blame, but honest, compassionate examination of why this particular dynamic was able to take hold. What unmet needs or unexamined beliefs made her especially susceptible to this specific kind of manipulation? This person often ends up in the protective foreclosure outcome we described earlier, building walls high enough to prevent repetition, but without ever actually understanding herself well enough to eventually take those walls back down again for someone who genuinely deserves access. Here's why the combination of both, full accountability alongside full self-compassion, produces something categorically different from either imbalance alone. And it's worth understanding the actual mechanism because it explains exactly what genuine survival requires that the other two outcomes don't achieve. Accountability, held alone, teaches you what happened and why, but without self-compassion, that knowledge gets stored alongside an ongoing sense of shame or self-blame that keeps the underlying vulnerability essentially unaddressed, even while the specific facts of what happened become perfectly clear. Self-compassion, held alone, protects you from that shame, but without accountability, it doesn't actually teach you anything you can use differently next time, because there's no honest examination of what made you susceptible in the first place. Held together, something different happens. Accountability, examined through a lens of genuine self-compassion rather than self-blame, becomes something you can actually learn from rather than something you have to defend against feeling. You can look honestly at the specific ways you extended trust too quickly, ignored red flags you now recognize clearly, or stayed longer than you should have, without that honest examination collapsing into shame, because the self-compassion sitting alongside it holds space for the genuinely understandable reasons you made those specific choices at that specific time, given everything you knew and everything you'd experienced up to that point. This combination, honest examination without shame, is what actually allows genuine learning to occur in a way that neither pure accountability nor pure self-compassion, held alone, is capable of producing. This is worth understanding through a specific practical example because the difference between these approaches becomes much clearer when applied to an actual pattern rather than discussed only in the abstract. Imagine recognizing honestly that you consistently extended trust to people who displayed early warning signs because you grew up in an environment where questioning someone's stated intentions felt genuinely dangerous and where your own survival, in some real sense, depended on giving people the benefit of the doubt rather than risking the conflict that came from voicing suspicion. Pure accountability without self-compassion tends to process this insight as, I should have known better, I keep making the same mistake, something is wrong with my judgment. Pure self-compassion without accountability tends to process it as, this wasn't my fault, he manipulated me, there was nothing I could have done differently. Neither of these actually produces lasting change, because neither one holds both the honest examination and the genuine understanding necessary to actually update the underlying pattern. The combination produces something different. I extended trust too quickly because of specific, understandable experiences that taught me questioning people felt dangerous. That makes complete sense given what I lived through, and it's not evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with me. And also, now that I understand this pattern clearly, I can build a different, more protective habit going forward, not because I'm broken and need fixing, but because I deserve better tools than the ones I was given, and I'm capable of building them. This combination, full understanding alongside full compassion, is genuinely what allows someone to actually change the underlying pattern rather than either repeating it unconsciously or protecting against it so thoroughly that genuine future intimacy becomes impossible. Here's what's worth understanding about why this combination is so rare. And it connects directly to something we've discussed throughout this entire series about how genuine change actually requires internal generation rather than external instruction. This combination, accountability and self-compassion, held simultaneously, applied to your own patterns rather than someone else's, isn't something most people learn naturally because most of us grow up in environments that model one or the other, rarely both together. Some people are raised in environments heavy on accountability and light on compassion, producing adults who default to harsh self-criticism whenever they examine their own choices. Others are raised in environments heavy on compassion and light on accountability, producing adults who struggle to examine their own patterns honestly without feeling like that examination threatens their sense of being fundamentally good and worthy. Very few people are given early in life a genuine model of both held together, which means most people have to actively, deliberately build this combination as adults, usually through exactly the kind of painful experience, like surviving a narcissistic relationship that finally makes the absence of one or the other undeniably, urgently visible. The most important realization, perhaps the one that changes everything, is that healing doesn't happen on the day you leave. For many people, leaving feels like it should be the finish line. They imagine that once the relationship ends, the worst is finally over, that freedom itself will automatically create peace. But life after manipulation often refuses to follow that neat timeline. Sometimes the relationship ends long before the emotional conversation inside your own mind does. Sometimes you leave physically while parts of you are still trying to solve a puzzle that was never designed to have an answer. You replay conversations. You revisit arguments. You wonder whether you misunderstood something, whether you were too sensitive, too forgiving, too impatient, or somehow not enough. And perhaps the hardest part is this. You may spend months believing you're trying to understand them, when in reality you're trying to understand yourself. That is the turning point. Because genuine healing begins the moment your attention quietly shifts away from the person who hurt you and returns to the person who has been waiting for your care all along, you. Not the version of you who believes she should have known better, not the version who keeps putting herself on trial, but the version who simply made deeply human decisions with the information, hope, and emotional needs she had at the time. There is extraordinary freedom in recognizing that vulnerability was never your enemy. The desire to love wasn't your mistake. The willingness to believe another person's words wasn't evidence of weakness. Trust, empathy, patience, forgiveness. These are not character flaws. They become dangerous only when they exist without discernment. Real healing doesn't ask you to throw those qualities away. It teaches you where they belong. Because the goal isn't becoming someone who trusts nobody. The goal is becoming someone who trusts wisely. There is an enormous difference. One is fear, the other is wisdom. Fear says, never let anyone close again. Wisdom says, not everyone earns access to me. Fear builds walls. Wisdom builds doors with locks. That distinction changes an entire life. You'll know your healing is becoming real when protecting yourself no longer feels like punishment, when saying no longer fills you with guilt, when silence no longer feels lonely, when someone's disappointment stops feeling like your responsibility to fix, when peace begins to feel familiar instead of uncomfortable. These changes rarely arrive dramatically. Most of them happen quietly. One day you notice that you no longer check whether they've viewed your message. One day you realize you haven't imagined running into them in weeks. One day you hear their name and your nervous system stays calm. Nothing spectacular happens. And somehow, everything has changed. Healing often looks incredibly ordinary while it's happening. It's made of small choices repeated over and over again, choosing rest instead of chasing explanations, choosing honesty instead of people-pleasing, choosing solitude instead of familiar dysfunction, choosing yourself, not because someone else failed to choose you, but because you finally realized you were never meant to abandon yourself in order to keep another person comfortable. Eventually, something remarkable begins to happen. The relationship that once defined your entire emotional landscape becomes only one chapter of a much larger story. Not the title, not the ending, just one chapter. You stop introducing yourself through what happened to you. You stop organizing your identity around the pain. You stop measuring your future against your past. The experience remains. The wisdom remains. But the suffering gradually stops being the center of who you are. And perhaps this is the quiet truth very few people talk about. The healthiest people are not those who have never been manipulated, nor are they necessarily the people who never trusted the wrong person. Life doesn't guarantee anyone that kind of certainty. The healthiest people are often the ones who have walked through profound disappointment without allowing disappointment to become their personality. They carry wisdom without carrying bitterness. They remember without reliving. They forgive themselves without rewriting history. That is emotional maturity, not pretending nothing happened, not pretending everyone deserves another chance, simply refusing to let yesterday become the architect of tomorrow. If you're watching this today while still questioning yourself, still wondering whether you were the problem, still carrying shame for staying longer than you wish you had, I want you to consider one possibility. Maybe your greatest mistake wasn't trusting someone who eventually betrayed that trust. Maybe your greatest mistake has been believing that one painful chapter gets to define your entire character. Because it doesn't. One relationship cannot measure your intelligence. It cannot measure your worth. It cannot measure your future. And it certainly cannot decide the kind of love you're capable of giving or receiving for the rest of your life. Every healthy relationship you'll ever build will ask for the very qualities you may have been tempted to bury: kindness, empathy, patience, openness. The difference is that next time those qualities won't be offered blindly. They'll be accompanied by discernment, by boundaries, by self-respect, by the quiet confidence that your value no longer depends on someone else's approval. That is why genuine survivors don't emerge emotionally empty. They emerge emotionally integrated. They don't become colder. They become clearer. They don't stop loving. They simply stop confusing love with self-sacrifice. And perhaps that's the greatest transformation of all, because manipulation teaches you to ask, how do I become enough for someone else? Healing slowly replaces that question with a completely different one. Does this relationship allow me to remain fully myself? Once that becomes your standard, everything changes. The conversations you tolerate change, the friendships you keep change, the boundaries you hold change, the love you accept changes, even the silence changes, because you're no longer afraid of being alone. You're far more afraid of abandoning yourself again. That fear, unlike the old one, protects rather than imprisons. So if you're still somewhere in the middle of this journey, if today doesn't feel like victory, if you're still rebuilding pieces you thought would never break, don't mistake being in the process for being stuck. Growth is often invisible while you're living it. Roots grow in darkness before anyone sees the tree. And one day, perhaps sooner than you expect, you'll wake up and realize the relationship that once consumed every waking thought has become something you remember instead of something you relive. Not because time erased it, but because you finally built a life larger than the wound it left behind. And maybe that was never the real goal. The goal was never to prove that a narcissist couldn't break you. The goal was to discover that even after being broken, you could rebuild yourself with greater wisdom, deeper self-respect, and a quieter kind of strength than you ever knew existed. Not the strength to endure endless pain, but the strength to finally choose peace every single day. That is what genuine survival looks like. If this message resonated with you, remember this one final thought. Your story is not defined by the person who tried to diminish you. It is defined by the person you chose to become after you walked away. And that ending has always belonged to you.